Picture this. You're sitting in the most important meeting room in the galaxy. Representatives from hundreds of worlds, all gathered in one massive chamber that's been the center galactic peace for over 1,000 years. The walls stretch up so high you can barely see the ceiling, covered in holographic displays showing peaceful trade routes, diplomatic agreements, and scientific exchanges between civilizations. This is where wars get prevented, where disputes get solved with words instead of weapons. Then suddenly, every communication device starts screaming at once. The emergency beacon cut through the Galactic Council chambers like a knife through butter. Ambassador Veltar, a tall, blue-skinned diplomat from the Centauri Republic, watched his translator spark and fizzle as report after report flooded in from the outer rim. The device had been working perfectly for decades, but now it couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of panic-filled messages pouring in from across the galaxy. The first report came from mining station Omega 7. Their message was short and terrifying. Unknown vessels approaching. They're not responding to hails. They're not on any registry. Wait, what are they doing to our ships? Then the transmission cut to static. Within minutes, dozens of similar messages filled the chamber. Colony ships vanishing without a trace. Entire space stations going dark. Military patrols simply disappearing from all sensors. But it wasn't until Captain Nick Sola's transmission came through that everyone understood what they were dealing with. Captain Nick Sola commanded one of the most advanced battleships in the galactic fleet. His vessel, the Harmony's Edge, had shields that could withstand the blast of a small star and weapons that could crack a moon in half. He was known throughout the military as someone who never panicked, never lost his cool, even in the worst situations. His final transmission still echoed through the chamber, and you could hear the fear in his voice. They're not just destroying our ships. They're eating them. The metal, the energy cores, everything. It's like they're feeding on our technology itself. I've never seen anything like it. They're absorbing our plasma blasts and growing stronger. Our shields might as well be made of paper. These aren't ships we're fighting. They're living creatures the size of cities, and they're hungry. Then static. Then nothing. The Void Hunters were back. Now, if you're not familiar with galactic history, let me explain why this news made every single delegate in that chamber go completely silent. The Void Hunters weren't just another enemy fleet or some new aggressive species trying to expand their territory. These were the monsters that made entire civilizations pack up their entire populations and run to different galaxies. We're talking about creatures that had terrorized the known universe for millions of years before most of these species had even discovered fire. They were older than the oldest civilizations, more advanced than the most advanced technologies, and hungrier than anything that had ever existed. The last time they appeared, 3 entire galactic sectors had been completely consumed. Not conquered, not occupied, consumed. Every planet, every asteroid, every speck of space dust, gone. The delegates looked around at each other with that special kind of terror, reserved for creatures that had ruled the darkness between stars since before time had meaning. You could see it in their eyes, regardless of what species they were. The insectoid representatives from Kepler Prime, usually so calm and logical, were clicking their mandibles nervously. The crystalline beings from the diamond systems were actually changing color, shifting from their usual peaceful blue to alarmed orange. Even the warlike Kragans, who never backed down from any fight, were shifting uncomfortably in their massive chairs. Their best fleets? Gone in hours. Their most advanced weapons, developed over centuries of scientific progress? They might as well have been throwing rocks at a hurricane. Every defensive strategy that had worked against other threats was useless. Every alliance, every mutual defense treaty, every carefully planned military formation, none of it mattered when faced with creatures that could literally eat starships for breakfast. The emergency broadcasts kept coming in, entire systems reporting strange shadows moving between their planets, space stations detecting massive energy signatures approaching from directions that shouldn't have been possible, colonial governors sending desperate pleas for evacuation ships that would never arrive in time. But then, as the panic reached its peak and some delegates were already discussing evacuation plans for their homeworlds, elderly Counselor Zephyran from the Archive Division stood up slowly. He was one of the few beings in the chamber old enough to remember the last Void Hunter invasion, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall. "There is one possibility," he said quietly, his words somehow cutting through all the noise and panic. "A file that had been gathering dust in our classified archives for decades coordinates to a small, unremarkable system in the outer spiral arm, a system we've kept under strict quarantine protocols." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "The planet has a designation in our files, Sol 3, but the survey teams who discovered it gave it another name. They called it a death world." The chamber fell completely silent. Even mentioning a death world was enough to make hardened military commanders nervous. These were planets so hostile, so dangerous, that even the thought of landing on them was considered a form of suicide. But Zephyran wasn't finished. His next words would change everything. "The warning label on this file has kept it sealed for over 50 years. It simply reads, 'Death World Do Not Approach. Inhabited by species too dangerous for contact.'" As those words sank in, a terrible and desperate hope began to form in the minds of every delegate present. Maybe, just maybe, they needed something more dangerous than diplomacy. Maybe they needed monsters of their own. Now, you have to understand why this planet was off limits. We're talking about a world so hostile that the very idea of life existing there seemed like a cosmic joke. When the first galactic survey ships detected signs of intelligent life on Sol 3, the crew thought their instruments were malfunctioning. The surface temperatures could flash freeze or boil most known species within seconds. Picture this. In some regions of this planet, the temperature could drop so low that the air itself would turn into liquid, while in other areas it got so hot that metal would melt like butter. Most galactic species needed carefully controlled environments just to survive, with temperature variations of maybe 5 degrees being considered extreme. But Earth laughed at the concept of comfortable living conditions. The atmosphere was a toxic cocktail of gases that would dissolve most beings from the inside out. What these humans called fresh air contained oxygen levels so high that it would literally burn the lungs of most species. The atmospheric pressure alone was crushing. Imagine trying to breathe while someone's constantly squeezing your chest with a giant metal clamp. And the gravity? It would crush the bones of 3/4 of the galactic community just trying to stand up. Most civilized worlds had gravity levels that were gentle, reasonable. Earth's gravity was like being constantly pressed down by an invisible weight that never let up. The survey teams calculated that most galactic species wouldn't even be able to lift their own heads on this world, let alone walk around. But here's where it gets really wild. That wasn't even the scary part. The scary part was what lived there. The initial survey teams had taken one look at the dominant species and immediately marked the system as a no-contact zone. These creatures, humans, they called themselves, didn't just survive in these impossible conditions. They had somehow turned this death trap of a planet into their playground. Think about this. While most species in the galaxy lived in carefully controlled cities with perfect climates, humans were out there climbing the tallest mountains on their planet just for fun. They would strap pieces of wood to their feet and slide down frozen mountainsides at dangerous speeds, laughing the entire time. They invented something called extreme sports, where the whole point was to do things that could easily result in serious injury, and they did it for entertainment. But the really terrifying part was how they dealt with conflict. These humans were so naturally aggressive that they fought wars against their own kind using weapons that literally split atoms apart. Let me put that in perspective for you. Most galactic conflict were resolved through careful negotiation, maybe some economic pressure, occasionally a small skirmish with energy weapons set to stun. Humans took the fundamental building blocks of matter and figured out how to make them explode with the force of stars. And then, just to make sure everyone understood how serious they were about fighting, they built thousands of these weapons and pointed them at their own planet. They lived on a world where nearly everything was trying to kill them, from microscopic diseases to massive predators. And they didn't just survive, they somehow turned it into an advantage. While other species had carefully evolved to avoid danger, humans had evolved to seek it out, fight it, and then figure out how to make pets out of things that used to try to eat them. Dr. Kip Hahn's original report was still classified, but word had leaked through the scientific community. The report had become something of a legend among xenobiologists, passed around in whispered conversations at conferences. The key sections were absolutely terrifying to read. They weaponized everything, the report stated. Their music is played at sound levels that would cause permanent hearing damage to most species. We detected rhythmic beating sounds that exceeded safe decibel limits by factors of 10. Their food would poison half the galaxy. They consume substances that are literally toxic to most known life forms and consider it normal cuisine. They eat plants that burn their own mouths and call it spicy food for enjoyment. But perhaps the most disturbing observation was this. They've somehow turned exercise into a form of controlled self-torture that they actually enjoy. We observed individuals deliberately subjecting themselves to extreme physical stress, lifting heavy objects repeatedly, running until their bodies were on the verge of collapse, then expressing satisfaction with the experience. They call this working out, and consider it a recreational activity. The report's final recommendation was stark. Maintain quarantine indefinitely. This species represents a fundamental threat to the psychological well-being of civilized galactic society. Contact protocols should never be established. For 50 years, that recommendation had been followed without question. The little blue planet was marked with warning beacons, and any ship that wandered too close was politely but firmly redirected elsewhere. Trade routes went around the system entirely. Even the most adventurous explorers gave it a wide berth. The general consensus among galactic leadership was that some things were better left alone. Why risk contact with a species that seemed to thrive on danger and conflict when the rest of the galaxy was working so hard to create peace and stability? Yet as emergency reports kept pouring in, as the Void Hunters carved through system after system like they were made of paper, some of the braver council members started wondering if maybe, just maybe, they needed something more dangerous than diplomacy. The question hanging in the air was simple but terrifying. What do you do when the monsters show up, and your only hope might be to call on something even more monstrous? The answer to that question was about to change everything. When the human ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the battlefield, every alien commander watching expected to witness another massacre. The Council's finest vessels were already floating in pieces around them, their elegant hulls torn apart by creatures that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of physics and warfare. But these new arrivals looked nothing like the sleek, sophisticated ships that the galaxy was used to seeing. These vessels looked like they'd been built in someone's garage by a bunch of enthusiastic amateurs who had more determination than sense. All exposed metal plating held together, with crude welding marks that would make any proper galactic engineer cringe. Weapon systems that looked like they belonged in a museum, mounted on the outside of ships where any civilized species would have hidden them behind proper armor plating. Admiral HFY of the Council Defense Force took one look at the approaching human fleet and felt his heart sink. Those poor creatures, he thought to himself. They have no idea what they're flying into. The lead ship opened communications, and instead of the formal military protocols that every galactic species used, a calm, almost casual voice filled the channel. Council vessels, this is Captain David Mitchell of the Human Defense Fleet. We've been monitoring your distress calls for the past few hours. Sorry we took so long to get here, but we had to swing by Earth first to pick up some volunteers and grab some extra supplies. Volunteers? Admiral HFY couldn't believe what he was hearing. The humans were treating this like they were heading out for a weekend camping trip, not facing the most terrifying predators the galaxy had ever known. Captain Mitchell, HFY responded, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. You need to retreat immediately. These are Void Hunters. Your vessels are not equipped for this level of combat. We've already lost 3 dreadnoughts in the past hour. There was a pause on the channel. Then Captain Mitchell's voice came back, and HFY could swear he heard the human chuckling. Well, Admiral, that's the thing about humans. We don't really do retreat. Besides, we've been looking forward to this fight for about 50 years now. What happened next defied every tactical manual in the galaxy, every strategic principle that had been developed over thousands of years of civilized warfare. Instead of the elegant energy weapons and sophisticated shields that proper military doctrine demanded, the humans came in swinging with what could only be described as controlled chaos. They didn't fire plasma beams or particle streams like every other advanced civilization. Instead, they fired chunks of metal at incredible speeds, using what they call kinetic weapons, basically space-age slingshots that hit with the force of small asteroids. But the really shocking part was explosives. While the rest of the galaxy had moved on to clean energy weapons centuries ago, the humans were still using chemical explosives that shouldn't have worked in the vacuum of space. Yet somehow, they'd figure out how to make them work anyway, turning their ships into flying fireworks factories that left trails of destruction in their wake. Their tactics were even more bizarre. Every other species in the galaxy had learned to fight with careful, measured strategies. You maintained proper formation. You used your shield effectively. You coordinated your attacks through careful communication and planning. The humans threw all that out the window and replaced it with something that could best be described as organized insanity. Commander Beth Rodriguez's destroyer, the Indomitable, was a perfect example of this human approach to warfare. When she saw a swarm of void hunters that had just finished tearing apart a council dreadnought 3 times her size, any sensible commander would have retreated to a safe distance and called for backup. Instead, Rodriguez pointed her ship straight at the center of the swarm and hit the accelerator. "Contact in 30 seconds, people." Her voice crackled over the ship's communication system, and Admiral Ketvar could hear the excitement in her voice instead of fear. "All hands. This is what we've been training for our whole lives. Remember, these things might be older than our sun, and they might have been terrorizing the galaxy since before humans learned to use fire, but they've never met anything as stubborn as a human with bad attitude and a ship full of explosives." The Indomitable dove straight into the hunter swarm like a missile, its weapons blazing in all directions. But instead of being torn apart like every other ship that had tried this approach, something incredible happened. The human ship started carving through the swarm like it was cutting through paper. The Void Hunters, creatures that had been perfectly coordinated in their attacks just moments before, suddenly seemed confused. They were used to enemies that follow predictable patterns, that use logical strategies that could be anticipated and countered. Humans, apparently, were none of those things. Other human ships followed Rodriguez's lead, each one using tactics that made no sense according to galactic military doctrine, but somehow worked perfectly against enemies that had never encountered such an approach. Admiral Ketvar watched in stunned amazement as his tactical displays showed something that shouldn't have been possible. The impossible happened. The Hunters, creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for eons, that had never been successfully resisted by any known force, actually started retreating. For the first time in galactic history, the monsters were running away. Here's where things get really wild. Most species, when faced with cosmic horrors from beyond the void, would count themselves lucky to survive and then spend the next century building bigger walls, creating better defenses, and hoping the monsters never came back. That's what every civilization in galactic history had done when confronted with something they couldn't understand or defeat. Humans? They decided to follow the monsters home. Think about that for a second. These creatures had just been terrorizing the galaxy, consuming entire fleets like snacks. And the normal response would be to celebrate that they were finally retreating. Any reasonable military commander would secure the area, tend to the wounded, and start planning better defenses for next time. But Admiral Jack Thompson, standing on the bridge of his flagship the Relentless, was already studying the retreat patterns of the Void Hunters with the kind of intense focus that most species reserve for avoiding danger. He wasn't thinking about defense. He was thinking about offense. "They're running," he said to his crew, and there was something in his voice that made even his own officers nervous. In all of galactic history, these things have never retreated from a fight, which means they're scared. And if they're scared, that means they have something to lose. The Relentless was leading a task force of human vessels into dimensions of space that didn't even have names in most galactic languages. While the Council ships stayed behind to secure the battlefield and rescue survivors, the humans were preparing to venture into territory that most civilizations considered to be beyond the edge of known reality. These were the spaces between spaces, where the normal rules of physics became more like gentle suggestions, where reality got thin and twisted, and where the things that lived there made the Void Hunters look like house pets. Most galactic maps simply marked these regions as void, do not enter, and left it at that. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Kate Harrison from the navigation station, her voice steady despite the readings she was seeing on her instruments, We're tracking multiple hunter vessels retreating along what appears to be a dimensional pathway. They're heading toward what our sensors are identifying as their primary nesting ground. She paused, double-checking her readings because they seemed impossible. It's inside a dying star system, sir. The gravitational distortions alone should tear apart anything that gets within 10,000 kilometers. And the radiation levels? They should kill everything within 1,000 kilometers, even with our heaviest shielding. The bridge fell quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed this information. They were talking about following these creatures into an environment that was essentially a cosmic death trap, where the very space around them would be actively trying to destroy their ships. Admiral Thompson looked at the data streaming across his command screens, then looked around at his crew. These were people who had volunteered to leave the safety of Earth and venture into the unknown to fight creatures that had been terrorizing the galaxy for millions of years. They had families back home, lives they could return to, but they were here instead, ready to follow him into what might very well be certain death. Thompson just smiled that particularly human smile that had been making aliens nervous for the past week. It was a kind of smile that said, I'm about to do something incredibly stupid, and I'm probably going to enjoy it. Well then, he said calmly, it's a good thing humans are too stupid to know when something's impossible. All ships, follow those creatures home. We're ending this today, one way or another. What followed was something that would be studied in military academies for generations. If any survived to build them, the human fleet pushed deeper into regions of space where the very concept of space became questionable, following energy signatures that led them through dimensional rifts and gravitational anomalies that should have crushed their ships like empty cans. But the really incredible part came when they reached the Void Hunters' nesting grounds. Instead of engaging in a long-range battle, like any civilized military force would do, the humans did something that defied all logic and reason. They decided to board the enemy vessels. Human Marines, equipped with nothing more advanced than kinetic weapons and environmental suits that were basically metal coffins with life support systems, actually volunteered to leave their ships and enter the Void Hunters' bio-vessels. Not to plant explosives and escape, not to gather intelligence and retreat, to hunt. Sergeant Mike Collins led the first boarding party onto a hunter vessel that was roughly the size of a small city. As they cut through the outer hull, he briefed his team with the kind of casual confidence that only humans seem to possess when facing impossible odds. Remember, people, these things have enhanced senses that can track us through solid metal. They're faster than anything we've ever fought, and they know this ship better than we know our own homes, he said as they prepared to enter the alien vessel. So, we're going to use that against them. The plan was pure human logic. Instead of trying to hide from creatures with superior senses, they would make as much noise as possible to draw them out, then use the ship's own twisted corridors and maintenance systems against them. They turned the creature's own bio-ship into a maze of killing fields, using sound to lure the hunters into carefully prepared ambush points, then disappearing into ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels like ghosts with guns. The psychological warfare was just as important as the physical tactics. The Void Hunters had spent millions of years as the ultimate predators, but now they were being hunted in their own homes by creatures that seemed to enjoy the challenge. For the first time in their ancient existence, the monsters were learning what it felt like to be prey. The final battle took place in a location that broke several laws of physics just by existing. Picture trying to have a fight inside the engine of a car while it's running, except the car is the size of a solar system, and the engine is a dying star that's literally tearing apart reality around it. The Void Hunter's primary hive was nestled in the gravity well of a dying star, feeding off the stellar matter like some cosmic parasite that had been there for millions of years. This wasn't just their home. It was their power source, their fortress, and their factory all rolled into one massive, living nightmare that existed in multiple dimensions at once. Any sensible species would have called in an orbital bombardment from a safe distance, maybe drop some antimatter warheads from a few light years away, and hope for the best. The galactic military doctrine for dealing with something like this was simple. Don't get close, use the biggest weapons you have, and pray it works. But when the human fleet arrived at this impossible location, Chief Engineer Tom Bradley took one look at the situation and came up with plans so insane that even his own crew thought he'd finally lost his mind. We're going to use their own feeding apparatus against them. He explained to a room full of alien military advisors who were staring at him like he'd just suggested arm wrestling a black hole with his bare hands. Admiral Veltar, who had been monitoring the human operations from a safe distance, couldn't believe what he was hearing. Engineer Bradley, with all due respect, that creature has been feeding on stellar energy for longer than our civilization has existed. Its biological systems are perfectly adapted to handle massive amounts of cosmic radiation. Bradley just grinned and pulled up a holographic display showing the hive's feeding mechanisms. That's exactly the problem, Admiral. These things eat energy, right? They've spent millions of years getting really good at sipping cosmic radiation at a nice, controlled rate. Well, what happens when you give something that's used to sipping through a straw the entire output of a dying star all at once, directly into its system? The room fell silent as the implication sank in. He wasn't talking about attacking the creature. He was talking about force-feeding it until it burst. You want to overload it? Asked Dr. Zefkar, the Council's leading expert on void hunter biology. Exactly, Bradley replied. Think it like this. You can drink water all day long and be fine. But if someone forces a fire hose down your throat and turns it on full blast, you're going to have a very bad day. The plan required human engineers to literally go inside the creature, into spaces where the very concept of matter became negotiable and the laws of physics were more like gentle suggestions. They would have to navigate through biological corridors that existed in folded space, where a wrong turn could send you into a dimension where time moved backwards or where gravity pointed in 17 different directions at once. It required pilots to fly ships through gravitational fields that should have turned them and their vessels into paste, navigating by instruments that were designed for normal space, while flying through regions where normal had packed up and left town years ago. Most crucially, it required soldiers to hold defensive positions in environments that violated the basic principles of survival, fighting off the hive's immune responses while their engineers worked in conditions that would have killed most galactic species just from looking at them. In other words, it was exactly the kind of impossible, suicidal, brilliant plan that only humans would attempt and somehow expect to survive. The actual mission took 14 hours of continuous combat in an environment that most species couldn't even comprehend, let alone fight in. Human teams worked their way through the creature's feeding systems, rewiring biological mechanisms that had been evolving for millions of years, all while fighting off defensive organisms that were essentially living weapons designed to protect the hive. Lieutenant Brian Park's engineering team spent 6 hours inside what could best be described as a creature's stomach, a space where the normal rules of cause and effect had given up trying to make sense of anything. They worked with tools that kept changing function depending on which dimension they were pointing in, following blueprints that had to be rewritten every few minutes as the creature's biology adapted to their presence. Meanwhile, Captain Lisa Wong's fighter squadron held off wave after wave of the hive's defensive responses, flying combat missions in gravitational fields that changed direction every few seconds and dealing with enemy weapons that fired backwards through time. The moment of truth came when Bradley's team finally connected the last bypass circuit. All teams, this is engineering. The feedback loop is in place. When this star goes critical in about 30 seconds, instead of the energy being absorbed gradually, it's all going to hit the creature's primary nervous system at once. When the hive ship finally collapsed, dragged into the heart of the dying star by its own feeding mechanisms that had been turned against it, the galaxy found itself in a very awkward position. The species they'd been too afraid to contact, too dangerous to trust, had just saved everyone. But more than that, they revealed an uncomfortable truth about the nature of survival in a dangerous universe. While the civilized species of the galaxy had been building better shields and stronger walls, humans had been learning how to become the thing that monsters check for under their beds before going to sleep. Ambassador Veltar's final report to the Council contained a single recommendation that would change galactic politics forever. Humanity didn't emerge from the shadows to save us. They were always there, in the dark places where we were too civilized to look, becoming exactly what we needed when the real monsters came calling. Perhaps it's time we stopped fearing the dark and started being grateful for what chooses to live there on our behalf. The Deathworlders had spoken, and the universe would never be the same.